Hi, this is Alan Levin here, and welcome. This is another in the series of conversations I have called Crossing the Boundary. And I try to find people who are doing very important and interesting work in the world who themselves have gone through some kind of major change in their orientation, their religion, their spirituality, their way of being, and discuss how that comes about and how they come to be the person that they are today. So today I have the honor, and I'm very happy to be talking with Dr. Jim Fadiman. Uh, Dr. Fadiman received a BA at Harvard and then an MA and PhD at Stanford in psychology. His undergraduate advisor happened to be at Harvard, Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass and who introduced Jim to psilocybin in Paris in 1961. Jim played a major role in the growing, emerging psychedelic scene and introduced a number of people to LSD and other psychedelics over the years before they became illegal. He was involved in the early years of computer networking and major studies in using psychedelics to enhance creative problem solving. The psychedelic research was halted in 1966 with the scheduling of psychedelics by the US government's war on drugs. With Robert Frager, Jim founded the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, now known as Sofia University, where I was an adjunct faculty for several years. He was also president of the Association for Transpersonal Psychology. For those who don't know, transpersonal psychology bridges, integrates, includes spirituality as part of psychology, or maybe psychology as part of spirituality. And he was also the director of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. According to Wikipedia, Jim Fadiman is a proponent of microdosing, and he collects anecdotal reports from those who practice it. And we'll, of course, be talking some about that. Just a few of the books he's published are Your Symphony of Selves, along with Jordan Gruber, Discover and Understand More of Who You Are, or We Are, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, Safe, Therapeutic, and Sacred Journeys, Essential Sufism with Robert Frager, and The Other Side of Hate, a novel about the counterculture. That's hate, like Hate Street. And Jim is also married, has children. He's married to the social activist and documentary filmmaker Dorothy Fadiman. I always like to start, Jim. Welcome to you, and good to be talking with you. I like to start with the source, where you come from, what's in your DNA. Can you share a bit about your ancestry, your parents, your family, the community you come from, and how you think that influenced the basic direction or values you took on or maybe ran away from?
Uh, well, given that there was kind of a break in the continuity of my life when I had a transcendental experience with psychedelics, prior to that, my grandparents on both sides came from Ukraine. One side of the family were political and were imprisoned by the Tsar for political activities. And while in prison, they were also very staunch atheists. And at one point, my grandfather in prison saw the guard talking to another prisoner who wanted to be with his wife. And he said, we can work something out. She was in the women's side of the prison. So he said, I want to too. And the guard said, you can't do that. He said, why not? You just did it for that other guy. He says, well, you're not married. We said, but we're atheists. He said, not my problem. So they got married. And when they got
And
out of,
no, atheists didn't get married.
well, they got married because they wanted to visit with each other. And, in prison, you do what you need to do. I haven't been in prison, but I gather that's a fairly realistic assessment. And so they eventually, after they got out of prison, he was a dentist, she was a midwife. It didn't look like career opportunities for political prisoners were going to be very good. So they came to the United States. The other side, my grandfather was one of 6 children, 5 girls and him. And the draft was on for, I'm not sure which war, but actually it was a peacetime. But the death rate in the Russian army from illness and malnutrition and so forth was very high. And there was no alternative. With that family constellation, he was going to get drafted. So they left to not have their one and only son drafted, and also went to New York.
Mm-hmm.
So I come out of political radicals and draft dodgers.
Mm-hmm. So that had some influence, I take it.
Well, it reappeared in my generation.
Was the other side of the family that you talked about that left because of draft dodging also atheists, or were they Jewish?
No, they were also
Jewish, though, right?
They I don't know how far back the atheism went.
Uh-huh.
But also when you're Ukrainian, you're clearly not Semitic. So it's hard to say,
I see.
I always kind of, I'm always a little thinking that Jewish means people who have some connection to Judaism. But I realize that that's not always the case. In any case, I was brought up by atheists. And
your
so
parents, your parents too.
And in college, I became a Unitarian, attended faithfully Unitarian Sundays and so forth, which didn't win me any accolades in my family. But when I later had psychedelics, I terrified everybody with the notion that spirituality was more important than intellectuality, which was the theological kind of core of my family. So anyway, I grew up in Southern California with all of the enjoyment of the outdoors that implies, and went to Harvard as an undergraduate because I was smart enough and was told it was a good idea to apply, and had Richard Alpert as a favored teacher when I finished Harvard, mainly having been in 17 theatrical productions rather than intellectual ones. Moved from physics when I found out it was really hard to psychology, which was really soft. And while living in Paris, I had a psychedelic, a kind of medium dose of psilocybin experience with Richard Alpert.
Before you go,
shook loose my belief system.
Jim, before you go into the psychedelic phase, would you say you had any sort of openings to any sort of spirituality before that, any sort of epiphanies or shifts from the transmission of atheism that came from your grandparents and parents?
No, actually, I can't say we were very serious atheists either. I mean, atheism is a kind of serious condition. You're taking a stand, you have rigid belief systems, you have your rituals and so forth. From a Martian point of view, it looks like a religion.
Yeah.
It has a very codified belief system. There are journals, there are places to meet and so forth. Agnostic means that your family wasn't interested in religion and didn't recommend any to you, and none of them just didn't. We also didn't talk about soccer. But we weren't soccer atheists. Okay, we just didn't talk about soccer. We didn't talk about Burma. We didn't talk about the Egyptian Empire. A lot of things just didn't happen in childhood. So I was accused in college in terms of the value of my background. One person said behind my back, "Does Fadiman ever have a serious thought?" So I was not exactly kind of intellectually prominent either. So the psychedelics shifted basic belief systems, first about what was important to me, Jim Fadiman, and then having a higher doses shifted my belief in who was Jim Fadiman and what was Jim Fadiman, which we will get to later, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I've looked at it, and I do have a degree in psychology. I've been a therapist, and I've written books about people's theories of personality. but I find my childhood remarkably uninteresting. No major traumas, no transcendence, um, not love affairs that didn't work out, but they weren't very strong in the first place, so that wasn't like a major issue. My parents did get divorced and remarried, and that mainly meant that I was back and forth between parents who were not first and foremost interested in raising children. They were first and foremost interested in their own lives and were very nice to their children.
They were intellectuals, I take it.
So I would say if I were in psychoanalysis, I would be able to bore the analyst considerably if we had to stay going back and back and back and back and forth to childhood.
Right, right. Did maybe you could talk a little bit about what that 1961 experience was like?
Yeah, I'm a graduate student at Stanford. I have left living in Paris because my draft board said, we've got a great opportunity for you to go to Southeast Asia and crawl through the mud on your knees and elbows, cuddling and run, or you could go to graduate school.
Mhm.
And for the first time, graduate school sounded fascinating.
Mhm.
And so I was accepted at Stanford for complicated reasons, and left Paris with considerable regret, and entered psychology with very little interest other than it was way better than my other opportunity.
Hmm.
Then I found a group off campus at Stanford who had a psychedelic clinic. We're doing high dose therapeutic work. And since I already had had some psilocybin in Paris, I was um, I was immediately attracted to that group, and they felt that even my small amount of experience was a good thing, and also they didn't have a psychologist on their staff. So I really trained with them on high dose clinical work for a couple of years and did a dissertation asking the very simple question, not after a high dose, did your spiritual life, magnify and did you have a whole lot of other beliefs? But I was taking it from a simpler place, which is what changed? What literal changes in your life did you make after psychedelic therapy that other people would also notice? So I was asking hundreds of questions that clients had mentioned because I was building a kind of repertoire, but questions like, are you spending more or less time with your children? Are you eating more or less meat? Are you more or less, are you going to church more or less often? Are you angry more or less often? The more or less question is a very nice one because most people can answer it. And not to anyone's surprise these days, people who'd had psychedelic therapy benefited and felt like they were healthier, demonstrated they were healthier, felt they were nicer, demonstrated they were nicer, felt that their work came more easily, demonstrated it in terms of improvements in both financial work and kind of pleasure in work. So it was it was not a very bold thesis.
Well, I have a couple of questions about that, if I
Yeah.
could. One is, what did a psychedelic session look like in those days, in the kind of setting you had? And were you also making use of strong doses of psychedelic yourself during that time?
Sure. Two things. One is the set and setting that is now de rigueur everywhere, which is the attractive living room and a male and female therapist, was developed by us in the early 1960s under the advice of Albert Hubbard, a mysterious character in early psychedelic lore, who suggested to a hospital in Canada originally that if it was a pleasant experience, it might be better for people. Taking psychedelics as we know now, in a highly clinical setting, without support, without understanding, is much more likely to have a terrible trip.
Right.
So when people came into our little set of offices, it opened up onto a very attractive, expensively done living room with beautiful hi-fi music and art and flowers and a male and female therapist who they had met before a couple of times. So it was we developed what would now be called a safe set and setting.
And it was with eye shades and music or talking
Eye
or
shades and music.
no, no interacting.
Very little, well, in the morning, almost no interacting because when people have a high enough dose, they don't want to interact. And also their speech and thoughts are slow, their thoughts are faster and their speech is slower than their thoughts.
Right.
So communicating actually is a way, it's a way of actually bringing someone down.
Yeah.
If they needed help, they would say um, something like, say, for instance, I'm dying.
Mhm.
And we would say, uh, it's all right. And we'd hold their hand.
Just let
Okay.
it happen. Yeah.
Because what we knew was they weren't dying, but their ego was saying, oh my God, I am being exposed for the kind of small piece of the world that I represent. I'm going to try and scare you into not finding out what you're just about to find out.
Yeah.
Because death is like, um, oh, I don't have my identity anymore. Is that death? And the answer we found out was no. That it was oh, this was my identity all the time, and a very small part of it was, say, Jim Fadiman.
And
So
so
the
you knew this
result of
because
transcendence is its own therapeutic modality, and you don't say much.
yeah, and you knew this because you were having those kinds of
Well,
experiences.
I had that experience, and the people who were running, were the clinicians in the clinic, had that experience.
Yeah.
Um, And it seemed to them that this was a good therapeutic system, particularly since you were giving one session
Right.
with what we would now call integration, but not too much integration, and a little bit of preparation. But mainly people were allowed to decide how seeing their identity in a different way shifted a lot of things for them.
Right.
And it shifted a lot of neurotic and sometimes very ill things. We had a few referrals for alcoholics. And alcoholics are still not well, it's not very well understood by the LSD and therapeutic community now. But then what we found, because we gave them basically the same kind of experience, one difference, by the way, 400 micrograms is enough for most people to transcend. At 400 micrograms, alcoholics would be walking around the room and saying, hey, man, I don't know what's going on. I really feel weird. So, however, 800 micrograms was very good.
How much?
And what we learned, 800 micrograms was fine. What we learned is that alcoholics had acquired the capacity to handle life when in an altered state. So that and there's lovely fun research out of Yale out of this, if you gave two groups of people a certain amount of alcohol, same amount. This group is undergraduates getting their credits for psychology. This is the town alcoholics. These people are drunk and on the floor, and these people are saying, this is a great study. I'd love some more. Okay, so what we learned, things like that. But with alcoholics, it was an interesting identity question, which is your body doesn't like alcohol. However, you, from your kind of eyeballs up, like it. So, and what would happen after, this was a kind of wonderful model, within a week of having the session, the one psychedelic session, almost all the alcoholics went out and drank a lot. And then they came to us and said, what the hell did you do to me? I didn't like it.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen that. Right.
Okay. And they would then basically stop drinking because it wasn't a positive event anymore. So those were among the kind of clinical discoveries we were making in the 1960s, and they are being rediscovered now by in the kind of research setting.
Yeah.
When you run a clinic, you don't run double blinds. You don't deceive people.
Right. Right. So your big shift in terms of your own way of thinking about yourself and the world happened through psychedelics.
Yep.
You became sort of spiritually oriented, you could
Right.
say.
October
Did you
19th.
adopt or get involved in any sort of spiritual discipline or practice? I know that Sufism, you wrote a book about Sufism or co-wrote a book about Sufism.
I taught Sufism for about 20 years, not from a Muslim perspective.
Mhm.
The teacher was Idris Shah, Shah, who came from a lineage in Afghanistan. And he basically presented Sufism to the West as a system of understanding the self uh, and and the larger world beyond the self. It was not presented as anything from Islam. In fact, the position that Sufism was taking is it predated Islam, and that Sufism appears in many ways in many countries, and it adapts to the system of the country. So if it's in a country which is 99.99% Islamic, it behaves in a way that
Right.
doesn't get kind of turned into something that you shouldn't be involved in. So Sufism becomes the esoteric part of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And the mystical experiences reported by Sufis are identical to the mystical experiences of Christians, of Jews, of Zoroastrians, of
Mm-hmm.
indigenous people, and so forth.
Right. Some of my friends some of my very good friends who are Sufis, also have a similar perspective to what you're saying, but they also have practices and disciplines, you could say, that are associated with their particular branch
Right.
or the transmitter of the Sufism that maybe Idris Shah, for instance. Did you adopt some kind of practice that went with that?
Well, the Idris Shah point of view didn't have practices because it wasn't Islam.
Well, not, no, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and I was basically teaching graduate students in psychology the tools that Sufism had found to be effective in helping people reflect on themselves, understand themselves,
Mhm.
um, kind of see how the world may be actually behaving instead of the way they would like it to behave. So these were toolkits that I was basically teaching to clinicians.
Right.
Uh, I did have over maybe 20 years, two or three students who became Islam, who converted to Islam
Mm.
by starting with Sufism and then continuing to expand beyond Islamic Sufism to Islam itself.
Yeah. Okay. So you were involved in the early developments of what came to be called transpersonal psychology.
Yeah.
Um, I'm getting from what you're saying that you sort of went essentially to the transpersonal, and then you maybe integrated psychology with that, although you did study psychology
Well,
in school.
I
So
think it's fair
was
to
there
say,
much of a bridge to becoming a transpersonal psychologist for you?
well, transpersonal psychology basically says the study of all of human experience.
Uh-huh.
Conventional psychology says we study all the human experience except spiritual because it doesn't it doesn't look good if you're trying to be a science.
Mhm.
So you have to understand that psychology is a wonderful term. It's called a social science. And if you ask a scientist, chemist, physicist, biologist, entomologist, etc., is psychology a science? They'll say, "Mm, maybe." But if
Mhm.
you say, is astronomy a science where there's no experimental work, okay, there's no double blinds, there's no physical finding. Usually, maybe we've now got one meteorite or two, but basically, it's an observational science at a distance, but it's a science.
Mhm.
Psychology doesn't fit into that paradigm, but it would like to. So transpersonal, which says we have as part of psychology all of human experience, which has to include spiritual experience. And I think the metaphor that I find most uncomfortable for my colleagues is to say, well, okay, you don't feel you want to cover spiritual experience because of various reasons. How about parapsychology, which has got incredibly hard science? They say, no, we don't, that doesn't work either because all of the things that you have the hard data for don't exist. Therefore, the hard data must be wrong, even though it meets all of our criteria.
Right.
And I say, well, how about sexual behavior? Do you study that? And they say, well, sure, we do that. Okay. I'm not real popular in conventional psychology. I
Uh-huh.
do. My first book was kind of for conventional psychology. It was a book of readings of things I'd liked. Um, but psychology um, has not has not been very successful. I mean, if you think about who is called to help when we have a crisis in human understanding, economists, military, um, not sure who else, okay, political. Now, if there's a flood and a number of people are really unhappy, who is it that you have help them feel less unhappy? Um, Psychologists, therapists, people who are kind.
Right.
But that's not a science.
Right.
So transpersonal, um, which included all of psychological science, um, was not. It was the kind of stepchild,
Sure.
and because it included the spiritual, we had the school had no trouble getting lots of students who wanted to get a full education about their own selves and about why is spiritual system so popular? Why do they work? What's the benefit of practices? There's a lot of obvious scientific kind of questions that can be asked of spiritual systems that spiritual systems are more than happy to help with.
Yeah. Was there any reason for uh, particularly starting the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology?
Oh,
Any special niche about it that was different than, say, CIIS, which was happening?
CIS happened considerably later.
CIIS came after.
Yeah,
Oh,
uh, transpersonal psychology. You have to. I mean, there is an interesting story. There's one individual named Tony Sudich. Tony Sudich is responsible for the creation of the structure of humanistic psychology, not the theory, but the association, the journal, the teaching. And about 10 years, 12 years into that, maybe a lot more, Tony realized that one of the problems with humanistic is they were anti-religious and spiritual experience.
right.
They were open to all kinds of things, but they weren't open to that. And what Tony was seeing is that as you begin to expand your point of view, um, religious and spiritual experiences are there.
Mhm.
So he also founded transpersonal psychology, founded a journal, founded an association. And why he was so interesting, Tony Sudich was a severely disabled person. He had had rheumatoid arthritis as I think a late teen. And by the time I met him, he was in his, I guess, 50s. He lived on a slant bed and he had a mirror so he could see people uh, indirectly.
Mm.
He could move most of the muscles of his face and he could move enough of one arm to turn on and off the phone. He made a living as a psychotherapist. He did not make a living with these systems that he developed with these two psychologies. Um, so he was a very unsung and remarkable person in the history of psychology.
Mhm.
And so when he became interested in transpersonal, he lived in Palo Alto. I lived in Palo Alto. Uh, and I was being overpaid by a company that I didn't respect. And I was feeling a little bit unclean. And so I volunteered time to help Tony.
Mm.
And that's what he was doing. And so I became an associate editor of the journal and so forth and so on. And transpersonal was fine because psychedelic experience was experience.
Right.
It was,
I was
it
going
was
to ask
something
you
human
that,
beings
but
did.
to what extent was transpersonal psychology covering up or a hidden agenda there being psychedelics, essentially?
Not at all. The early issues are full of psychedelic articles, and then as the culture shifted, um, people's submissions to the journal. Well, when the government said psychedelics are evil, bad, and we have no evidence,
Yeah.
um, it's tricky.
Mhm.
Okay, so my dissertation, for example, um, if you just think about it, first major, research survey study, perhaps 60 to 80 people, lots of data. Why wouldn't it be published? Well, because I finished it just as the government said, there is no
Mhm.
use.
Mhm.
And a journal would be
A
foolish,
legitimate use,
right?
right?
It's kind of like if I wrote an article on benefits of child molestation.
Yeah.
And they say, well, you know what? I don't think we want this article because we already know that it's not going to work for us and it'll get us a lot of
Mhm.
trouble.
Yeah.
So,
So,
so transpersonal kind of, is out there on its own and has been all these years, um, with the same kind of general orientation of why would you not look at all of human experience?
right. So my question then is, given your deep involvement with transpersonal psychology, using those
Yep.
approaches to help people transform their way of life, their inner life, um, Sufism, mystical experiences, strong psychedelic experiences, which you described a little bit. Um, you're now considered the father, grandfather, godfather, guru of microdosing.
Right.
So, how do you see that related to those interests in transpersonal psychology and mysticism and so forth?
Well, I mean, I love these kind of through lines that you are asking because I don't, they don't feel that way. I was totally committed to this high dose transcendental. Um, you
Right.
discover that you're part of of everything and part of divinity, and that's makes your life work better. That's only high doses. Medium doses, which are quote therapeutic, where the therapist can still bother you and interfere with your experience. That's just a different world. I wasn't very interested. It was not bad, but it was easier to transcend, I felt, where your neuroses become unimportant. They're there, but they're unimportant. I mean, for instance, if this shirt had a rip in my armpit, the shirt would be defective, but I wouldn't have any emotional issues around it because it's just my shirt.
Yeah.
Well, imagine if your psychological issues were at that level of, well, it's my shirt, but it's my trauma, but it doesn't really need to be kind of endlessly chewed on
Mhm.
because I'm more than that. Okay. The little girl who, when I was in fourth grade, had said, I won't kiss you. It didn't change my life. Okay. So it
This new
wasn't,
perspective, it didn't
yeah, my
change.
perspective was that
Yeah.
the best I can come up with, as an adult, is that seemed like a very appropriate behavior for third or fourth grade. And I didn't think about it more than telling my mother, and she said, well, that's the way life is, and so forth.
Right. So you learned that
Yeah.
it
So I'm going
didn't
to get
change.
back to the question.
You learned
How did I
that.
get into microdosing? Okay.
Okay.
Um, at the theoretical level, which I find almost unbearable to even mention theory, um, it is my opinion that the universe has a sense of humor. And here is someone who's devoted his life to high doses. And what do I put in his way is an opportunity to study itty bitty bitty tiny doses that have one clear characteristic: no classic psychedelic effects. Okay. However, I have enormous, I think, natural curiosity as animals do. And when I came across the notion that a very tiny dose had some effect, I followed it and had a few opportunities where I got feedback that said, yeah, this is really something.
Mhm.
Um, and started to collect people's responses to microdosing. I invented the word. It is used in other sciences, but I didn't know it at the time because I thought it was something like micrograms. So microdosing seemed like a nice term, micro being millionth. And I was originally talking to people who were using LSD. Um, so gradually, more and more in evidence and more interest and more people asking me and me asking more and more people. And I've ended up um, keeping up with the high dose world, both because I have a lot of friends who are the major players, and two, it's still of interest. But I have been exploring microdosing very often because nobody else was exploring that part of it. And so it has become more and more popular, including that the word now is becoming kind of trivialized. which is you can now microdose coffee. And I did run across one about microdosing marriage, but I didn't follow that up. Um, but it's now generally a real small amount of something. And what we try and do is a microdose is a really small amount of something, but microdosing is over a period of time, period of several weeks, with a protocol and with intention, and microdosing cannabis or microdosing coffee or microdosing lion's mane mushrooms doesn't have the same overall kind of basically a much more substantial effect that grows over time and is different from most pharmaceuticals, which are symptom suppression. So they aren't supposed to have any long-term effect. So when people recover from depression using microdoses, it very often is that they have recovered from depression. Antidepressants never allow you to recover from depression. It's a very different model.
Right.
So I got very interested because it was fascinating. And then the reports began to be more expansive than mental illness. And that was really fascinating. Because we have tended to think of psychedelics as mental, either spiritual or mental medicine.
So you don't necessarily see it as a replacement for the use of psychedelics, as for having a psychedelic experience, moderate or high. You see it as a sort of a helpful, you use the word vitamin, some sort of metabolic shifter that
Yep.
helps people to feel better, function better. Basically that, feel better and function better. Is that
Yeah,
right?
function better is the good term because that doesn't force you into medicalization. See, function better is if someone says to me, quoting, I used to get B's, now I'm microdosing and I get A's.
Mhm.
Okay? There's no mental illness in there. There's no symptom substitution. There's no revelation that the reason I get B's is because my mother treated me like a girl and I was a boy, so forth. If someone says, again, wonderful story of a man in his 40s, he's a runner, loves running, and takes very, very detailed, looks at every time he's running. And he tells me that when he microdoses for his daily run, it's better. And I say, can you give me any details? He says, well, actually, I'm going to do a race, a half marathon in a couple of weeks. And I've been running, for about 15 years. Why don't I just microdose and let you know? So I get a note from him a week or two after his run, and he says, I bettered my time. Now, this half marathon, I bettered my time by 20 minutes. That's very large. And then he said, that's basically the best time I've had in 10 years. Okay. That holds my attention. Again, we're talking now just about someone in really good health with a muscle system that's working very well. But when he microdoses, the system is improved in its function in the direction that he wishes. And that's very exciting because it also should work then for people who aren't runners, who aren't in great health, but whatever the system is that allows your legs to work better, perhaps microdosing it helps there. So that's how I've been collecting.
I want to come back to that, but I know you also have a book coming out about microdosing, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to say something about that and what's the name of it and what's it going to cover.
Uh, Shameless product placement moment here.
Yes,
The
absolutely.
title of the book is
No shame, no blame.
Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance. It's coming out. It's coming out middle of February, but in our wonderful world, it's available on Amazon.
So we can pre-order it.
You can pre-order it, and what Amazon does, and it's really kind of nice, is they say we'll hold your money until it's published, because also we and the publisher at some point will decide on the price that we, Amazon, will charge you, which will be $1 or $2 less. And so we will, no matter what you've sent us, we'll charge you only what it actually costs. So it's a kind of risk-free pre-sale. And it turns out that authors push really, really hard for that, because then that first day, you're getting all the pre-orders from the past 6 months. Let me get rid of this.
Well, I'll be posting links to your websites and also to your book and books.
Hold on, I can't.
What's the matter? You're working with the lights?
No, that was my co-author calling me and not knowing that I'm on a podcast. So that was that. Okay, so
Okay, so I have another perhaps challenging question a little bit, or at least in my own mind, it's a question that I have concerns about. I was a hippie in the 60s, and
right.
my psychedelic use was along those lines. Then I became involved in a deep meditation discipline practice for about 10 years. And when I returned to engage with psychedelics, it was with ritualized sacred ceremonies. And I guess I have some concerns that this is the way that these substances were related to for thousands of years. They were treated as sacred medicines. And I'm wondering, is it possible that it's becoming trivialized and people are not relating to it in that way when
Well,
they
let's go back a few thousand years,
Mhm.
and we now ask indigenous people, let's say, one that I know very well, the Bitwi in Gabon, Africa. This is ibogaine.
Right.
And they say, how do you use ibogaine? Oh, we use it for the ritual of becoming a grown-up. It's a 3-day event. It's several doses of ibogaine. People talk to their ancestors. It changes their status in the tribe, and it changes their life. And then you say, do you use it for anything else? Yeah, actually, we do. We take small amounts when we go hunting.
Right.
What we've learned is when you go hunting, what's really helpful is more stamina and better vision. You can see better when you're looking for animals in trees. So I said, well, do you use it for anything else? I said, well, we don't really say this much, except that you're a very nice anthropologist, and some of the ones we talk to are real jerks. We also use it for better sex.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How long have you been doing that? As long as ibogaine exists. Mm-hmm. So what we're finding when you actually see, most indigenous people are not asked by anthropologists, kind of, what do you take for a headache?
Mm-hmm.
How do you cook your potatoes? They want to know, who's your second cousin and how do you call that? And what's your rituals and what's the name of the gods and all the kind of groovy stuff that anthropology, the good stories.
Yeah.
Rarely kind of ask very normal things. There are ethnobotanists who do ask very normal things, as my daughter is a professor of ethnobotany, so I know what she asks. But it looks like, well, let me tell you kind of the embarrassing way I learned this. I'm busy inventing microdosing. Nobody has ever done this before, and my God, am I special? Because people are really liking it, and everybody likes me. Mm-hmm. And a friend of mine is an anthropologist, and he says a little bit, he knows exactly what your question was. And he says, did it ever occur to you, Jim, that indigenous people might have tried low doses over the couple of thousand years they've had this? And I thought, well, maybe they did. And if they did, they would use correctly what's appropriate for low dose. And in a ritual setting where they're attempting to connect with the divine, they would use a high dose. So what we're finding is that microdosing is probably as extensive as high doses if we look at various world cultures.
Well,
and that makes
let me respond to that with some other thoughts. Is it likely that you're talking about cultures that have these substances, these plant medicines, usually as sacred substances,
Yep.
in which the people that are using it in small doses for other purposes have engaged in those ceremonies, and they have allowed themselves to connect with the
Yeah.
mystical, with the divine,
Right.
and then taking small amounts of it helps them reopen to that connectedness in whatever they're doing.
Well,
I've experienced that myself. So, have you found there to be a difference in when people are microdosing after they've had whatever macro doses or sacred experiences than people who are microdosing essentially? I mean, here's another. Well, I'll get to the
got
other
it.
question. Answer that one first.
Well, the answer is I'm just thinking of, a couple of thousand reports, and that's not what people report. Basically, there's a ceiling above which it's not microdosing. But in the microdosing area of dose, it has none of those effects. And sometimes I say that the one thing we know about microdosing is you won't have therapeutic insights. You won't have breakthroughs about historical trauma. You won't have connecting to whatever you call the higher self or higher beings. That just doesn't happen. It doesn't mean that it's not a good. And now, if you take what we might call is uh, some people call mini dose, which is 2 or 3 times as much as a microdose, then what we know is a lot of the cognitive improvements of microdosing goes away. And you begin to have intimations of the higher dose experiences. And the technical term for that is you feel high. And one of the things when we're writing about how do you dose safely and correctly is if it feels like you're a little high, that's too high a dose. Now, we have a similar pattern with social drinking. When someone says, I think I've had enough, no, thank you, they're saying, I'm pretty clear that if I have one more drink, I will shift from enjoying the social behavior, whatever, and I'll start to be out of control. I'll say things I don't want to hear in the morning and so forth. I will connect with the higher effects of higher doses of alcohol. But I know the difference and I know when to stop. So it's a very good question. And if I'd had any evidence that it was this connecting, and because what's happened with microdosing is people who are afraid of psychedelics very often say, well, why don't I microdose to check if my fear is justified? And it's not, it makes sense except for this difference. So let me give you the core difference. This is another way of thinking the whole thing. This is from Connor Murray, PhD from UCLA, some research that he's been doing. And what he said is it looks to him in terms of beneficial physical and mental effects, not psychic and psychodynamic and spiritual, but for the effects of making your life physically and mentally healthier. It may be that the correct dose is a microdose, and that all of what we've been spending our lives being excited by are what we would call overdoses. So it's a way of reframing it the other way. It's as if we discovered microdoses, and then someone says, well, what if I take 10 times as much for my running? Will I run 10 times as fast? And then the person finds out that they've spent the day lying on their back, but they now have never before spoken to the god of running. So we're really talking, I mean, the simple answer is the disconnect between microdosing and higher dosing is real.
So, do you feel that the efforts of psychologists and transpersonal or otherwise to help people learn about the causes of their depression and process those and heal somehow the inner child or whatever framework one uses for that, heal the wounds
Right.
inside by being aware of them,
Yeah.
is not necessary anymore, that one
No,
can just
no.
feel
I mean,
better by microdosing?
the question is how many ways does can you heal something? And the answer is obviously in a world of creativity and diversity and mental acuity, there's more than one way.
Mhm.
I mean, why is there more than one theory of psychology? soon as you have a field which has dozens of theories, what you know is nobody knows. There isn't laws. There isn't facts. Okay. And what you find when you, because I did have to study all the therapy literature when I was doing my dissertation, is one is there's almost no therapy literature because therapists don't like to talk about what they're doing, and the overall awareness between schools is people who are really good at any school of therapy, both like other people who are in other schools of therapy. They don't feel any competition. People who are less good are more rigid and say, I'm a Rogerian. I'm a Gestalt, which means I only know one set of tools. And I go to my garage and I say, well, you can't use the drills. You only can use the hammers and the screwdrivers and so forth because they're from this brand. And I'm a brand person. So the problem is good psychotherapy works if the person is a good enough therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Theoretical is for helping the therapist work with things. But as I've been reading this wonderful oral biography of Carl Rogers, and his criticism of other kinds of therapy is someone says, I had a dream in which, I was sitting on an ice cube and then a bear came and licked the ice cube. And a Rogerian says, that's a very interesting dream. What do you think about it? Mm-hmm. A Freudian says to himself, aha, it fits a piece of theory. Mm-hmm. My question is going to be to make sure that I can be sure that it fits a piece of therapy.
Well, okay. What is the therapy?
There's a distinction there that's very important, which is, are you paying attention to whatever is the client comes with, or do you have something that you come to with the client?
Yeah. Okay. I hear what you're saying. I guess I'm wondering, though, by microdosing, is it possible that people are bypassing some important work?
Oh, well, they're not bypassing it, they're not doing it. Meaning, if I take vitamin C, am I bypassing important spiritual work? Well, you say, well, not exactly, but are you doing any important spiritual work when you take vitamin C? No. Did it ever occur to you? No. Do you know anyone who's ever used vitamin C for spiritual work? No. Maybe the question needs to be reframed, which is it more important to heal past traumas one by one in a one-on-one setting, or could there be alternate ways? And all the spiritual systems say there are alternate ways. Psychedelics says there's also alternate ways, and we can kind of explain them in more of a Western setting. Mm-hmm. Remember, Buddhism's position is your personality doesn't exist. Therefore, improving it is kind of silly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Yeah.
And understanding that your personality doesn't exist is an incredibly difficult thing to do if the only tool you have is a personality.
You have to improve your personality in order to understand that your personality doesn't exist.
And that's very hard.
Yeah.
And
so let me ask you another issue that I have concerns about.
Sure.
Feeling better, but I'm also hearing you say people end up being kinder. Now, I imagine that may be true for a lot of people.
Yep.
There's a whole lot of people who take psychedelics and are really assholes, even people who guide people in psychedelics. Yep. And I think there are people who would be taking microdoses who are
assholes.
Billionaire tech people, for instance, who support Donald Trump and who supported the insurrection on January 6th. And
so, what we find is when we talk to people, say like Musk, who says, I've used psychedelics, he means ketamine and has nothing to do with psychedelics. For example, ketamine is an antidepressant.
Some of them are using psychedelics. They're using low doses or psychedelics.
Now there are people who are bad. I mean, we've found is people are able to retain their evilness, in our opinion. But
Mhm.
I find very few evil people who say, you know, the thing that I like about myself is that I'm really evil.
Mhm.
And the things I do really hurt people, and that gives me a certain visceral pleasure. I don't find that. I find that evil people sound a lot like good people when you ask them how they feel about what they're doing.
Mhm.
So, whether my hope is that psychedelics, and it has in many cases, changed people's lives. I just got a note from someone that says, I have a student who just took ayahuasca. She said it's changed her life. She wants to devote her life to studying this and helping other people. Um, that's a life change and that's a belief change. But I guess here's one that I like. I was at Yale and I was talking to a lot of undergraduates, and I asked them, because I was in a research mode, if they would fill out a little form about their psychedelic experience and what it had meant for them, if they'd had any. And I had two that were very interesting. They were both about religion, about religious experience. And one of them said, I have I've taken psychedelics, and I realized that my religion is hopelessly constricted and inappropriate, and I am moving past it. And another said, I have found that psychedelics have given me the opportunity to go deeply into my religious tradition, and I'm finding it incredibly nourishing. The wonderful thing is, both of them had the same religion. So
Yeah.
what it did is it opened up both of them in ways in which, when they were integrating and trying to put it together, they found it led them in different directions.
Well, I found that in my own experience. I mean, I'm born Jewish, a Jewish family.
Right.
Psychedelics definitely opened me to look at that, but not to choose it as a path. And I know a number of people who took psychedelics and they said, "Whoa, I'm going to be Jewish," and they start going
Right.
to shul and doing all that, all the prayers
Yeah.
and so forth.
And Zalman Schachter and
Amen, of course, yeah.
yeah, I mean, there
Um,
were wonderful people who became, see, remember, every religion, you can say religions name mystics, Jewish mystics, Christian mystics, Zoroastrian mystics.
Islamic Sufi mystic.
Okay, and when we get to the mystics and you ask what's going on,
Mhm.
it all sounds a lot the same.
Mhm.
And how you encapsulate it. I mean, one of the things that I used to say to people, um, God spoke to me. I said, does God speak English? Does God speak any other language? And it was this kind of moment oh, there was some kind of inner translation that happened, because it is unlikely that the deity speaks American English. But I was spoken to in American English.
Mhm.
So maybe there's like a transformer, you transform high voltage to low voltage because high voltage burns your hands and head off, and low voltage, allows you to use your razor and your computer. It's the
Mhm.
same electricity, but low doses have very different effects. And I like this. I just thought of this lovely new metaphor. This low doses have very different effects than high doses.
Mhm.
And high doses, you have to really look for safety.
Yeah.
Okay. In California, when we have fires, PG&E turns the power off because so many of the huge fires in California were probably started
Mhm.
by a transformer in a high wind,
Right.
um, crackling, and because it was not, it was old, and it made sparks and it made a fire. And because there was a high wind and it was dry, poof. Okay. Nothing wrong with electricity.
Mhm.
But when high doses, you really need a lot more. Uh, you have to handle it differently,
Mhm.
and it's hard to say that um, my computer and a high dose transformer are using. It doesn't look like the same stuff. We know it is because we know that it is a very small version, but it's used in entirely different ways, and we need different ways to control it, to protect it, to preserve it, to do all the things we want it to do.
What about guides? Isn't it sort of an essential for consciousness change that
Uh,
there's someone who holds the space or even offers perspectives that allow a person to direct their attention in appropriate ways?
I find psychedelic guides a necessity for high dose. And one of the few reasons I wrote the book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, is it has 2 chapters, and that's about all most people ever read of the book, on how to do high dose sessions for people, right? High dose sessions for people in a very safe way. Because if I talk to 1,000 people and say, how many of you have had a high dose experience? And 850 raised their hands. I said, how many of you did it in a clinically appropriate and legal situation? And like 2 hands.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the reality and writing a book which would help people in the reality of their situation. And it seems to be a useful book to have out there, since that's what is the reality.
But what about all the folks that are microdosing? Don't
They
need guides for like still in this world in
it's
order
a
to.
different term. It's a different term because, and you'll see the difference. There are no microdose guides. There are microdose coaches. Okay, a coach is someone who, as long as you're doing it right, they don't say much. Okay, but what they say is very critical. You ever had a yoga class?
Yeah.
Okay, and you're in the yoga class, and the yoga instructor kind of walks behind you and moves your neck a little. Okay, that's coaching. They don't sit next to you and they hold up your arms and move you so that you're in the right position. And as soon as they let you go, you're off. That's not coaching. Coaching is aiding people when they need it, and it turns out having intention helps. Having integration after or during microdosing helps. It's beneficial. And we're just coming into this world where microdose coaching is now an occupation. And I've just been following a couple of, I teach in some microdosing coaching groups because people feel good about it. But we're still in a place where most people microdose without coaching. And that's why a book was necessary for that kind of basic stuff. But the main point of the book was to allow people to know the extent of microdosing, which is much wider than higher dosing. There's just more things. Nobody takes high dose psychedelics to run a half marathon.
Right.
And anyone who would take a high dose to run a half marathon finds that wasn't a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are now, of course, as you know, widespread efforts to regulate, decriminalize, legalize psychedelics, maybe certify therapists or arrange some kind of therapy programs that include psychedelics. I know it's not specifically about microdosing, but I think of you as somebody who has a lot of knowledge in this whole field. So is there anything you can say about what you think would be the healthiest way to move forward with integrating these substances into our society?
Well, we have the kind of regulatory system of round holes, which is in order to get allowed to help people, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States has a round hole, and they've worked decades to make it smooth and round, and you have to do exactly what it says. Now, if you have something which doesn't fit the hole, no matter what you do to it, for instance, pharmaceuticals are never sold with the insistence that you have to have therapy.
Right.
Psychedelics are almost high dose, are almost always suggested available with some kind of support and guide. The system has no way to determine that model.
Right.
Okay. So what the system has said is the system is more important than reality. Now, if that sounds like religion, that's your own opinion.
What
So
would you like to see going forward?
The regulatory agencies to understand that that a pharmaceutical is not an isolated event. It actually always occurs in a context of human behavior. But the human behavior is something that the kind of observational factual science doesn't know how to handle. That's why the research on psychotherapy is so poor, because the models available don't fit.
Mhm.
What are you going to say? Well, how much benefit did you get from the third dream you had last week? Okay. Oh, let me get rid of that too.
Here we are.
Okay.
So, yeah, any thoughts on the path forward?
Well, yeah, I think that what people are trying to do is um, chop as much of their both work with the government to say, how about reality? But while we're working on reality, we will do whatever you tell us to do. But you then have to agree with us if we do what you tell us to do, that you won't then stop us at the end and say, we had some other ideas we didn't tell you, and you didn't do those, and you're out.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that happened with MAPS or with Lycos is they did everything that the government asked and a lot more. And it was the lot more that did them in,
Mhm.
because the lot more wasn't within the framework. It was more useful and more valuable and more better understanding and would be helpful for the FDA to understand. But they had as a committee people who had no understanding of psychedelics, not a single clinician on that advisory panel.
Right.
And they basically said, how round are, Lycos, how round is it? And Lycos said, well, there's some places where it isn't round because it doesn't fit. And they said, well, then we can't approve it.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, there was,
I'm
it
wondering
was,
if decriminalization would be the better path
well,
forward.
decriminalization is an easier path because it puts responsibility back on individuals.
That's right. And it takes it out of the hands of having the government tell who people can, when you can do it and where you can do it and how much you.
I mean, the government, we decriminalized Coca-Cola. Okay, remember, it used to have cocaine in it.
That's right.
So we
Well, and
decriminalized,
they're
and people
decriminalizing and
misuse
legalizing
Coca,
marijuana. Yeah.
right? People misuse Coca-Cola, but that's people misuse all the drugs that are approved too.
Yeah. Alcohol, for instance, right?
Yeah.
So, Jim,
But
just to
what
finish
I'm
up
saying is the system that is designed was not designed for what psychedelic therapy actually is.
clearly, right?
Okay.
Right.
So so those are two either the organization that gives you permission has to acknowledge that you're doing something that they're not set up to do, or they say, since we're not set up to do it, we're not saying what you're doing is wrong, we're just saying we can't approve you, which is a little more defensive. It's kind of like, if we're the organization that measures the durability of auto tires, and you want us to approve a gasoline additive that lightens the weight of the car, therefore extending the life of the tires.
Mhm.
We can't do that. We're not saying that your additive may or may not do what it says. We're just saying we measure tires.
It's not what we do. Yeah. Yeah.
And until that changes, and for example, under the new administration, there will be a distinction between things that the administration cares about and wants to regulate, and other things that they don't care about and won't bother to regulate.
Mhm.
And psychedelics looks like it may be in that second group. So it'll be, if the government is kind of if on high, say, don't make trouble with these people, just figure out a way to approve them, they'll figure out a way.
Mhm. So here we are. It's 3 days after a very major election in this country. Besides that, the world is going through what the world is going through. Um, what's your feeling in terms of the role that psychedelics, microdosing, moderate dosing, high dosing can play, and
Sure.
whether you feel optimistic at all about that in the world as it's evolving?
Microdosing is going to do fine because one is it's more and more psilocybin mushrooms. Psilocybin mushrooms grow on every continent but Antarctica. There's 200 species. They're also incredibly easy to grow with what are called grow kits, so that people are doing it at home and avoiding the entire issue. Um, and indigenous people have been microdosing for thousands of years and won't stop. So microdosing is probably going to continue. It will not. It's been remarkably invisible in all of the legal arguments, because all the legal arguments are about high doses, because high doses are visibly disruptive. Positive or negative, they're very disruptive. Okay. If I have a heart condition and I have an operation, it's majorly disruptive to the decline of my heart. And I like that, that major intrusion. Okay. So for microdoses, they're probably going to continue in this very popular, easy to get, remarkably accessible world, independent of regulation. Decriminalization will make it easier.
I guess what I'm asking, though, do you feel it will have a effect on the direction that we're going in this world?
Well, Paul Stamets says people who use psychedelic mushrooms are nicer. Nicer goes a long way in the world we're coming into, where we're going to need all the nicer we can get. The near term doesn't feel good for any of us. And for the people who voted in either way, they're all going to suffer the same basic economic disruption. The one difference, as I get from my media feed, is the person who's being made into the kind of health czar seems to have good feelings for psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
And since there will be a certain arbitrariness to what is, he also has a great feeling for healthy grain, for non-GMO foods,
Right.
For improving the soil rather than not enriching. So there's a lot of things that may get support that have not gotten. Nobody's mad at them, but they have gotten very little support. So there may be all kinds of changes at the level of substances and what you put in your body that may be less restrictive than the Food and Drug Administration. At the high dose level, similar, which is the same issue. If it bothers the government, they will stop it. If it doesn't bother the government, they're probably much more likely not to get involved in a administration with a strong indication that they love to deregulate. And certainly the American medical system, with its pricing structure for pharmaceuticals higher than any other country in the world, there's a lot of room for deregulation.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jim. I think we're about at our time, and I really appreciate it. I appreciate all your answers to my sometimes challenging questions.
Oh, I loved your challenging questions. Those were the fun and interesting ones.
Good. I figured you would.
Because you got me to think in ways where I don't have some kind of, I've thought about this and I have a kind of almost ready answer. So this was the fun part for me, was a number of your questions, which I thought, well, that's another way of looking at it. Let me see what happens when I put that into my little idea mill, and what we see comes out. So this has been very good for me.
Likewise for me. I learned a lot.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
See you online, everybody.
Great.